Hi, it's Mrs. Hall, and we are starting a new unit. Unit 10 is all about testing and individual differences. And by individual differences, we're going to be looking at intelligence primarily. We'll also be looking at gender differences and various things like that. So when we look at testing, that's what we're going to start with. Our first few lessons are going to be about testing. So we're talking about psychological testing. We've already talked about personality inventories, and we'll bring those up again in this unit, but for the time being, we're going to look mostly at intelligence testing. So here we go. Intelligence testing actually began with Sir Francis Galton, and he was looking at various family names, and he noticed that a lot of families, especially successful families, tended to be successful throughout the generations. So he wanted to see if there was some sort of an innate mental ability. This was the first attempt to see if there was any sort of innate mental ability. Before this, we hadn't really thought about intelligence a whole lot, or we'd made assumptions about it. So the way Galton did his tests is he just looked at simple sensory processes. He measured very simple things. We're back to that sensation and perception unit. We're back to the very beginnings of psychology when we were doing similar things to Wundt and to William James. And what he really did, he was looking at the nature-nurture debate, and he wanted to know, is our intelligence something that we're born with, or is it something that is derived as a result of the family and the environment that we're brought up in? Not that his studies did a whole lot in answering that question, but what he did do is he created an interest in measuring mental ability for the first time, which leads us to Alfred Binet. Binet was a Frenchman, and at the time that Binet was living, the government passed a law that required all children to attend school. Before this time, who were the children who attended school? The kids who had money, the kids from the affluent families. Well, now the government said, no, we are going to provide an education for everyone, and all children must attend school. So Binet was commissioned to develop a test to determine subnormal mentality. So he developed an objective test to identify children who were likely to have difficulty in regular classes. So he was looking for the kids who were not going to do real well in the educational system that was in current existence. Contrary to Francis Galton, Binet looked at abstract reasoning skills to measure his mentality, and he came up with the idea of mental age. A mental age referred to the cognitive ability of a typical child of that chronological age. His test was not developed to figure out why the child was at that particular ability level. He only identified French children needing attention. Now, I underline French children because it is important that we know that we were only looking at French children. So this test is going to be biased. It's not going to be universal. In other words, British children couldn't use this, or American children couldn't use this, because it's targeted at French children, and only those French children who were going to need attention in the educational system. It's the first intelligence test that was ever created. Which leads us to Lewis Terman. Lewis Terman was a Stanford University professor, and he took Binet's test and he revised it. First of all, he made it for American children. In revising it, he also noticed that Binet's Paris-developed age norms did not work well with his California school children. So he revised that test to make it less biased toward the French children and made it more universal, or at least made it so that American children could take it. And another thing that he did is he extended the upper range from teenagers, which is where Binet stopped, and he extended that to superior adults. So it's a much broader test now. And what his test was called was the Stanford Binet. He didn't use his own name for it. He used his university because they funded the money for him to be able to do this. And he created the Stanford Binet, giving Binet credit because he was the first to create this intelligence test. He developed it in 1916, and we still have this test today. It's been revised, we've changed it around a little bit, but we still do have the intelligence test called the Stanford Binet. Terman came up with a new scoring technique. He called it the intelligence quotient, and you're familiar with it, you call it IQ. I'm going to teach you something about IQ today that is going to be different than anything that you've heard before. I'm going to teach you what IQ is, first of all. It's a quotient. It's a mathematical problem. It's a person's mental age divided by their chronological age and multiplied by 100 just to get rid of the decimal point. So when we're looking at intelligence, obviously we want to be average or above. So the average would be 100. A person who has the same mental and chronological age would have an IQ, or an intelligence quotient, of 100. With this quotient, it made it possible to compare children of different ages. We don't use the intelligence quotient as Terman used it in the very beginning anymore today. We still use the term IQ, but what IQ means basically today is just an intelligence test score. It's not what they know, it's not what they can do, it is simply a score on a test. So to say someone has an IQ of 160, sure, we have the idea that that person's, I'm sure, brilliant, but really that 160 is just a number. It's just a score on a test, on a particular test. And because we use so many different tests today, you've got to ask which test that number comes from, because not every test today is normed at 100 being the average. So you've got to ask that question. Today's intelligence test scores no longer are a mental age divided by a chronological age. It's a person's mental ability score based on their performance relative to the average performance of people the same age. Now you might be asking, well, how is that any different than the way Terman used it? Well, now we're taking average performances and we're norming our tests. We're looking at people who take this test, we're taking the ages, and we're finding an average. And that's what makes this different. We're going to be looking at percentiles and things like that later. But that's how we do our testing today, our intelligence testing, and we'll talk more about ACT testing, SAT testing, MCATs, LSATs, GREs, all those different types of aptitude tests later on in a different lecture. So the average for most intelligence tests today is still 100, but not all of them. Just be aware of that. And we're going to look later at the normal distribution curve, but what we find is that 2/3 of all people score between plus and minus 1 standard deviation from the mean. And if the mean is 100 with a standard deviation, which most intelligence tests have a standard deviation of 15, we're looking at the average intelligence scores being anywhere between 85 to 115. David Wechsler, he was a doctor at Bellevue Medical Hospital, and his primary role in the testing and intelligence unit, we're looking at his improvement of adult measures of intelligence. Now granted, Terman did take Binet's test and improve it to include superior adults, but that was all that we had for adult intelligence. So he developed probably the most widely used test in America today for testing intelligence. The first one he developed is called the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And then because that worked so well and people liked it so well, he was asked to create one for children so that we had more than just the Stanford Binet. So he created his WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. What he did that's different from Binet, and why people liked it so well, is he didn't just have one score anymore. It wasn't just one intelligence score anymore. He made a formal computation of a separate score for 3 things. He had verbal intelligence, performance intelligence or nonverbal intelligence, and then a total or full scale intelligence. You know what this is when we're talking about the ACT. You've got your reading score, you've got your writing score, you have your math score, your science, all those different scores, and then they're combined together to create a composite score. Wechsler started that. He was the first person to create a test that had scales and had various scores that then were combined to create a composite score. And he is the one who came up with this new scoring system that he based on the normal distribution curve. This scoring system has actually been adopted by all intelligence tests today, including the Stanford Binet. I told you that it had been revised, and this is one of the many revisions that's taken place on this test. So now we're going to be looking more at normal distribution, we're going to be looking at standard deviation averages, and we're going to be looking at intelligence scores. When we look at intelligence scores, we're going to be looking at them a little bit differently, and we'll get into that in a later lecture. But for the time being, this is your history of where intelligence testing came from. I've introduced you to the primary intelligence tests that we use today. They would be the Stanford Binet and the 2 Wechsler tests. There are others, but if you're going to have your intelligence tested and you're going to find out what your number is, what your intelligence number is, you're going to be given one of those 2 tests. It would probably be the Wechsler test. So make sure that you write down any questions that you might have about this history, and then we will talk later in class. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.